Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the podcast, The Endurance of Labor Laws. I am your lovely host, and today is episode 103, and we are moving right along. Today we're going to talk about a specific type of byproduct that is a result of, of industry. It's called slag. Slag is a byproduct of smelting ores and used metals. Now, the concept and the concern of slag has really come up quite a bit ever since the 1980s, and the reason for that is because slag is sometimes one of the byproducts that is not being disposed of properly, which is why we have some of these superfund sites across the United States. So again, sometimes people do not dispose of it properly or use it properly because they literally don't know, or the technology or the knowledge was not present at the time that they were dealing with slag or this byproduct, or they simply ignored it for whatever reason. I think the reason why we do have some issues with slag is because people just did not know what to do with it, or they did not know how to properly store it or dispose of it. So I thought, well, this is a type of waste. So we are going to go through the different types of waste that are associated with manufacturing and just any and all types of waste that we encounter within the United States, because whatever we encounter here is nothing compared to the industries over in India and China, because they are notorious for polluting the environment. So again, when I'm talking about this stuff here in the United States, it's not to shame and blame the United States, not by any means, because the United States is a much cleaner country than the majority of the planet. So really the only way that some other place would be cleaner than the United States is if people don't live there. So obviously we have a really good country. We do a really good job of cleaning up our messes. We just need to do an even better job of it. But the good thing about the United States is that we acknowledge stuff and we get stuff done. So I just want to be clear about that this is not to shame or blame. This is truly for information purposes and to just raise awareness about, because one of the things that I came across when I was researching Superfund sites was all the different terms that they were using to describe the different types of byproducts and waste and things like that. So I'm learning all these words as well. So I thought, well, if this is not common knowledge to me, it's probably not common knowledge to the rest of the United States. Unless you work in this industry of Superfund sites, if you work for the EPA, or if you work in the construction industry, or you work in iron or steel or something like that, that would be relevant to your line of work. But, if you don't have that line of work, then more than likely you are not going to know about this stuff. So sometimes ignorance is bliss and sometimes it's not. In the case of waste and byproducts and Superfund sites, ignorance is not bliss by any means. So, but the good thing about this is that they have found a way to make slag, a way to help in other industries. So that's one of those things that they can take a byproduct or a waste product and turn it into something good. And that's one thing that I really want to focus on when we are going through all these different Superfund sites and we're looking at all the different types of industries that are associated with these different companies or these different types of sites or these different types of waste, because there is always good that can come out of it. So I just want to make sure that that is clear and that we are remaining positive in this podcast, because the last thing I want to do is be bitter or give the impression that, things are bad when things are not bad. Things are actually tremendously going very well in the United States. The biggest thing I don't like is inflation and gas prices, but even then, we can always turn that around. So I'm not worried about it, not by any means, because, as you guys know, I definitely pray about a lot of things, and I know that God answers prayers because He's answered quite a few of my prayers over the years. So I can't complain about our Heavenly Father. But before we dive into this puppy, I want to give a big shout out to my listeners, because as usual, I love to see you guys. I'm very grateful to you. So a big shout out to Illinois, Virginia, Texas, my lovely neighbor, and Tesla. So I'm not saying that Tesla, I'm seeing it on here, but I just am so thankful that Tesla moved from California to Texas, because it provides Texas with quite a few jobs. And also, I think it's a true testament that Elon Musk is trying to save his company from overtaxation. Like, he did not want to leave California, and I don't blame him at all. but it wasn't sustainable or profitable to stay in California, so he had to move his headquarters and move quite a few employees to the state of Texas. So God bless you, Elon Musk. Thank you so much for moving your industry and for employing so many people. I greatly appreciate that because that's really important to the United States. And so a big shout out to Texas, Oklahoma, New York, British Columbia, Oregon, California. In terms of countries, the United States, Canada, and the Russian Federation. Okay, so let's dive into this puppy. So it says slag is a byproduct of smelting ores and used metals. Broadly, it can be classified as ferrous, which is byproducts of processing iron and steel. I think it's ferroalloy, which is byproduct of ferroalloy production, or non-ferrous base metals, which is byproducts of recovering non-ferrous materials like copper, zinc, nickel, and phosphorus. Due to the large demand for these chemicals, or excuse me, these materials, my apologies about that. This is not a chemical, these are materials. Due to the large demand for these materials, slag production has also significantly increased throughout the years, despite recycling, most notably in the iron and steel making industries and upcycling efforts. The World Steel Association estimates that 600 kilograms, I think they're kilograms, how do you pronounce that, of byproducts of slag are generated per ton of steel produced. And there's a chart that shows me in this article, and the production of steel and iron has gone up tremendously since the 2000s. So if you're not invested in steel and iron, you might want to invest in that. I'm not a financial advisor, but when you take a look at the charts and how much goes into steel and iron and how much people use it, especially in construction, I would definitely invest in that, me personally. So it says here slags are transported along with slag tailings to slag dumps where they are exposed to weathering, sparking concerns about leaching of potentially toxic elements, also known as PTEs, and hyperalkaline runoffs into the soil and water, endangering the local ecological communities. Leaching concerns are typically towards non-ferrous or base metal slags, which tend to have higher concentration of PTEs. Dissolution of slags can produce highly alkaline groundwater with pH values above 12. The calcium silicates in slags react with water to produce calcium hydroxide ions that leads to a higher concentration of hydroxide in groundwater. This alkalinity promotes the mineralization of the dissolved CO2 from the atmosphere to produce calcite, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which can accumulate to a very thick level. Consequently, this can also lead to the dissolution of other metals in slag, such as iron, manganese, nickel, and I think it's molybdenum, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. My apologies if not, which become insoluble in water and mobile as particulate matter. The most effective method to detoxify alkaline groundwater discharge is air sparging. According to the 2019 International Energy Agency, also known as IEA report, the iron and steel industry directly contributed to the global CO2 emissions and accounted for 7% of the global energy demand, which is technically not a lot if you think about it. In nature, iron, copper, lead, nickel, and other metals are found in impure states called ores, often oxidized and mixed in with silicates of other metals. During smelting, when the ore is exposed to high temperatures, these impurities are separated from the molten metal and can be removed. Slag is the collection of compounds that are removed. In many smelting processes, oxides are introduced to control the slag chemistry, assisting in the removal of impurities and protecting the furnace refractory lining from excessive wear. In this case, the slag is termed synthetic. A good example of steel making slag is quicklime, and I think that's magnesite, MAGNESITE, are introduced for refractory protection, neutralizing the alumina and silica separated from the metal, and assisting in the removal of sulfur and phosphorus from the steel. As a co-product of steelmaking, slag is typically produced either through the blast furnace, which is oxygen converter route, or the electric arc furnace, the ladle furnace route. To flux the silica produced during steelmaking, limestone and or dolomite are added, as well as other types of slag conditioners such as calcium aluminate, or I think that's fluorspar or fluorspar. I'm not sure how to pronounce that word. Slag is usually a mixture of metal oxides and silicon dioxide. The major components of these slags include the oxides of calcium, magnesium, silicon, iron, and aluminum, with lesser amounts of manganese, phosphorus, and others depending on the specifics of the raw materials used. Then the next section, just real quick, slags can serve other purposes, such as assisting in the temperature control of the smelting and minimizing any reoxidation of the final liquid metal product before the molten metal is removed from the furnace and used to make solid metal. Utilization of slags in the construction industry dates back to the 1800s, where slags were used to build roads and railroad ballast, I think, either blast or ballast, it's spelled kind of funky. During this time, it was also used as an aggregate and integrated into the cement industry as a geopolymer. Learn something new there. Dissolution of slags generate alkalinity that can be used to precipitate out metals, sulfates, and excess nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, in wastewater treatment. Similarly, ferrous slags have been used as soil conditioners to rebalance soil pH and fertilizers as sources of calcium and magnesium. Because of the slowly released phosphate content and phosphorus-containing slag, and because of its liming effect, it is valued as fertilizer in gardens and farms and steel-making areas. So that is it for this podcast, kind of short and sweet. I could have gone into more detail about the chemical composition of these, but the words are just huge and weird because I'm not a chemist, so I know nothing about this stuff. But also, it gives abbreviations like from the periodic table. So if you want to know more about slags, you can definitely just look that up. Again, there are 3 different types of slag. There's ferrous, ferroalloy, and non-ferrous base metals. Excuse me, got the hiccups a little bit. So if you want to research those and look them up, by all means do so. But it's a very interesting topic, but this is something that happens in so many industries with slag and with metal and with furnaces. So just think about how much metal is used in the United States. Almost every building has metal in it, especially if it has a steel structure. So that's why slag is a result of the construction industry, and it's also used in the construction industry because you're dealing with metal, you're dealing with you're dealing with metal, you're dealing with steel. And so that's another reason why we kind of need to keep our eyes open in regards to communist China, because several years ago, communist China bought up all the steel and then drove up the cost by 500%, if not more. It was pretty bad. So that's one reason why the cost of goods went up here in the United States and around the world. So, for example, I had mentioned this before in a previous podcast, where I knew a guy that worked for the city here in Oklahoma City, and he worked in the waste management department, and he was the one that orders the trucks, the garbage dump trucks, that go around to different apartment complexes, and they pick up those huge metal dumpsters, and also they go around to places of business like restaurants like McDonald's, Wendy's, Sonic, whatever. Well, here's the thing. The cost of those trash trucks or dump trucks greatly went up by thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, because of China buying up all the steel. So it was costing more money for companies to make and produce these garbage trucks, which, in the effect, drove up the cost of selling those trucks to different utility departments across the United States. So just think about the bills that you are paying. We owe money in bills, right? Like we have to pay our bills in terms of utilities and things like that. But the cost of our utilities could be greatly decreased if we were being more aware of what countries like communist China are doing to affect the global market. Whenever communist China does something, it's almost always going after something in the United States because they want our money. Another example of this, I said this in a very early podcast episode of this podcast about China buying up property here in Oklahoma, and then they have been buying up all these farms from farmers through a third party, and they've been purchasing these properties through a holding company. So the farmer doesn't know they're actually selling their property to communist China, otherwise they would not do so. But they think they're selling it to an American, like up in the Northeast, through a holding company, because there are so many holding companies that are located up in the northeastern part of the United States. So one of the things that they're doing, these holding companies, I don't think they're being very American at all by this. They're selling a lot of property and a lot of industries to the Chinese, knowing full well that most Americans don't know they're actually doing business with the Chinese. And one example here in the United States and in Oklahoma is that there are quite a few farmers here in Oklahoma that have sold their property, their farms, unknowingly to a Chinese company, and now they're making marijuana here. They're growing it. And it looks like one of these compounds because that's basically what it is. They put up all these chain link fences that normally we don't do here in Oklahoma. And they basically have slave labor. They fly in these Chinese workers that are slaves. Are they citizens of communist China? Yes, but their labor, they are forced into that kind of work. Because again, if you're not super wealthy, and if you can't pay off a government official over in China, in communist China, then you are a slave. And they decide what job you do, what you make, and where you live. So basically, the majority of the labor force in China works for the government, or they report to the government, even though they do not have like a civil servant job. They're forced into doing things they would not normally want to do, and it may not even be their natural skill set. But because communist China greatly controls the labor over there, they determine what happens to their citizens on a way more extreme level than we have ever seen, in our day and age, so to speak. But anyway, China, they bought up all this stuff. So not only have they bought up a bunch of the steel, they are still purchasing quite a bit of property in just small farming communities that you would never think to look. And so instead of communist China going through the front door of the United States, they're creeping in through the back door, hoping that no one will notice. Well, guess what? A lot of communities are starting to notice that we've got some very strange industries taking place, especially within Oklahoma, and it greatly concerns us because if communist China is doing that here in Oklahoma, more than likely they're doing that in other states where nobody thinks to look. I love my home state of Oklahoma, but I mean, who thinks to look here for stuff dealing with international affairs or communist China or, whatever the case may be. When people think of international business or international affairs or international relations, they think about New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, like these big, to-do places. Well, communist China has very much figured out that, they should avoid those places if they want to do business on a cheaper level and save a lot of money. Just go to the places that nobody thinks to look, which would be like Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kansas, states like that. No offense to my fellow states in the United States, but, Oklahoma is not known for being successful or super productive, even though we are. It's just that, we're kind of hidden in the shadow of New York City and Los Angeles. So that's why countries like communist China set up shop in places and in states and territories where no one thinks to look. That's why I keep saying greed is not just in Wall Street. Greed is everywhere. And so where you need to be looking for greed is with these holding companies that are up in the northeastern part of the United States, because a lot of these companies up there don't give a rat's posterior about the rest of the United States. Like they're stuck-up snobs that just want to make millions of dollars and make a quick buck, and they don't care who they sell their soul to. Because here's the thing, I would think that if you're doing business with communist China and you know about some of the shady stuff they're doing, and even if you didn't know they were being shady, I would think your radar would go up, a red flag would go up that say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing business with these people. But unfortunately, these holding companies, all they care about is money. They don't really care about people. Because if they did care about people, if they did care about human rights, they would not be doing business with a communist country that is notorious for human rights violations, notorious, especially against women and children. I mean, communist China still forces women to have abortions. I mean, they either have a one-child law or a two-child law. Well, guess what? If you want more children than that, you have to pay off a government official thousands of dollars. And if you can't afford to pay them, guess what? The local police, well, first of all, your neighbor rats on you, which is horrible. And then the local police, they come pick up your wife, your girlfriend, whoever, and they force her to go to a state abortion clinic, and they force her to get an abortion, and they sterilize her right there on the table as well. So, being that we know that to be true about communist China, I think it's deplorable and sickening that these holding companies knowingly and willingly do business with such a horrible country like communist China, and they're selling out millions of acres and millions of properties across the United States to a very corrupt and greedy country, because even though communist China is communist, there's still a lot of greed there. Like, communists in the United States are stupid. Like, they don't understand what communism really is. They just want to steal from the rich and supposedly give to the poor. Well, I'm sorry. The Robin Hood theory is still thievery, because thievery is wrong. It is still a crime. It doesn't matter what country you're in. Thievery is thievery. Well, here's the thing. What communists do is they give themselves permission to steal. They give themselves permission to be a thief, all for the sake of, oh, this person hurt my feelings, I don't think they should be successful. Well, guess what? Your feelings don't matter when it comes to the law. Your feelings don't matter when it comes to morals and values. You're supposed to do what's right regardless of what your feelings are and regardless of what your personal opinion is of somebody. That's why I've always said in this podcast, everything that we do needs to be legal and moral. Because just because it's legal does not mean it's moral. So, for example, in regards to these holding companies, they may be doing things that are legal, but it's not moral. And slowly the United States is waking up to the fact that these holding companies, I think they need to be investigated, because they are doing so many shady, crooked, deplorable things, doing business with people that don't care about the United States. It's just crazy. And plus, they're doing business with people that really want the United States to suffer financially. I don't know how anyone could do business with a bad company. I just don't get that. It doesn't make sense to me, because you can't tell me they don't know or that they don't have an inkling or something. It's just like, I understand it may be illegal what they're doing, but, me personally, I don't do business with people that don't respect or love the United States. I just don't. Because why would I want to line someone's pocket that doesn't value human life and doesn't value the future of the United States? So I think we need to be aware of those things. And the steel industry is one of those things, because communist China, they've been ruling that market for a long time. And it's because, we stupidly allowed them to buy up all this steel, like hoard it all. I mean, it's interesting to me that no one's really called China out on this, but yet you have these watchdog groups that call out, pharmaceutical companies for, being the only one to produce a certain drug. Well, they are the only ones that can produce a certain drug if they have a patent, and if that patent is not expired. That's just the law, and that's how it is. You have to wait till that patent expires, or they sell it, or until something becomes generic. So you have these watchdog groups, usually kind of liberal, that go after pharmaceutical companies, but really they just want the money from these pharmaceutical companies, because they know that drug companies are loaded with millions, if not billions of dollars. But, they go after certain people, but then they won't go after corrupt countries that cause a problem and that have massive human rights violations. They greatly pollute the environment and don't really care to clean up. So, that's why I keep saying throughout the podcast that, the United States is doing really good. We are one of the cleanest countries on the face of this earth. Why else would people be moving here? And we are one of the nicest countries. And we are one of the most successful countries. And we actually have one of the strongest currencies. And we've had the strongest currency technically since the founding of our country. So I would think that rings true to how wonderful and great America is. So for sure, just be aware of those things. Because there are some things that I research here that my mouth just drops and I go, oh my goodness, I wish I had known this back in my 20s. There's just so many things that I wish I knew sooner. But it's good to know it now. So, for sure, let's keep things on the up and up. But that is it for this lovely podcast. But until next time, I pray that you're happy, healthy, and whole, that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.